Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Finlay Johnson. I'm the interim CEO for the Association for Electronic Music. Thank you for attending session 2 of our metadata working group, chaired by Charlie Phillips from PTR Strategic and Chloe Johnson from Verify Media. This is the second session. The first one we did earlier in the year is on our YouTube channel. We'll share that later on as well. That was aimed at primarily DJs and creators, sort of an introductory component to metadata. And this session's for power users, so people already professionals in the space, and why the data matters, and why good data matters specifically. So on that moment, I'll pass you over to Charlie.
Great, thanks very much. Can everyone see a screen that says why good data matters on it? Hopefully you can, because I'm sharing that. Can you see that? Excellent. Well, thanks for the intro, Finlay. Very quickly, as Finlay just said, this will be a kind of a presentation for the next 45 minutes, something like that. I'll kick off and do the first few slides, then I'll hand over to Chloe, who's the co-chair of the AFEM Metadata Working Group, to go into things in a little bit more detail. And then when we do the Q&A session at the end, we will edit that out of the video so that when we post the session up onto YouTube, your questions and answers will not be on that video. So don't feel that you're going to be putting anything out there on YouTube that you don't want to see in the future. At that point, it will be a closed private conversation. So with that, let's kick off. So Chloe decided that to elevate the tone of the discussion, she would get all Shakespearean on us. And a quote to illustrate what we're going to be talking about today with regards to publishing rights and recording rights is two households, both alike in dignity. You get extra points for knowing which play that comes from. But it's interesting that in the end of that particular play, they all end up murdering each other. So maybe it's not the best starting point. But anyway, nonetheless, we'll move on. Those of you that were on the first webinar a few months ago will remember that we started off by trying to kind of track the journey of creation of music from songwriting through to performance, through to recording, and then what you need to do with your data or rights that exist around the sort of roles and elements that you've contributed, whether that's as a writer, performer, publishing company, record company, etc. So just to quickly remind ourselves of how we illustrated that in the last session, here's our troubadour looking guy with his guitar. So he, in this instance, is representing somebody writing a song. So at that point, we're talking only about compositions. Then that artist could be the songwriter, could be somebody else, but somebody sings that song or they perform in some way the sounds of that song and make a recording of it. Publishers and writers, when the recording is done, but it doesn't have to be done in sequence, it can be done in parallel. The owners of the rights in the composition, whether that's the songwriter themselves or the publisher, if the writer is published, will then register with all the relevant data to the collecting societies that are out there representing the rights, managing many sort of revenue streams ranging from on-demand, public performance, radio, broadcast, etc., etc. And it's at that point that the ISWC code is applied to the individual work, the individual song, musical work, the copyright in that gets its own ISWC. Chloe will talk about this in more detail later, but we're doing just the kind of reminder overview at this point. In parallel with that, on the recording side, the entity that's going to be distributing that sound recording has a similar job to do with their data. As we all know, if you're an independent artist or label, you will use a distributor normally, and they will have a whole bunch of fields that you need to fill in order to make sure that when the audio file is delivered to them, all the surrounding metadata, everything else that they need is all delivered correctly and in one place, so that when that file and package of other stuff goes up onto Spotify, the track title is correct, the artist title is correct, but also some of the rights and all of those sorts of things are also described correctly too. The distributor then sends those packages formatted and correctly over to the service providers. Apple Music, YouTube, Spotify, or whoever. And then people get to listen to the music. So it's available for listening, it's available for broadcast, download, streaming, and whatnot. So from a creator's point of view, that's the process. You've got this parallel path, songwriting, publishing, and recording, but ultimately the end point is that it's kind of the single thing that's available out there for people to enjoy. They don't really want to know or care about the fact that there are all these different rights types and people involved in a particular thing. So there's quite a lot of work involved in disaggregating the combination of rights through the metadata so that the right people get paid. Now, in the last session, again, a little bit of recap, another way of visualizing how rights are exploited and how revenue gets paid back to people who have a right in a piece of music is the pie chart that we've got on the screen in front of us. It's a similar kind of thing to the previous slide, but instead of it being a linear process from the point of view of a single creator, what we're seeing here is a recording and its composite elements being the musical work written by the songwriter or composer, controlled by a publisher, the artist, who may or may not be the songwriter, but they've got different rights in the recording. And then you've got the producer and the record company who have a very close relationship with the artist, who may or may not be the songwriter. But you can see from the arrows pointing out that the entities that have the three rights in the center each have a job to do in terms of getting the description of their interest and their rights out to all these different industry partners, which is the red arrow, so that when the guys in blue on the outside of the slide offer up the music, or they license it, or they have listeners or radio stations reporting and paying licenses, all of the money can be allocated properly to the correct entities and then paid back through to the center where those green arrows are pointing back into all the different rights types. So this is a simple one shot, if you like, at basically how it all works at the highest, simplest possible level. But now we can go in and have a little bit of a look in some more detail at the actual types of rights and where the money comes from. So very quickly, I'll just skip through these because this is fairly straightforward. But the idea here is just to introduce at a high level the types of rights that exist by reference to what this actually means in terms of what most people are familiar with. So the rights are the right to reproduction. So basically copying something. That is obviously copyright in terms of its kind of activity. It's almost always an exclusive right requiring direct permission, but it covers things like creating CDs, copying the audio to make something available on demand, and obviously things like printed sheet music. Derivative works are also a kind of a form of copying if they're taking certain elements and using them in a certain way. That is a separate right type, so separate revenue. The right of distribution of copies is also a separate right. And then, of course, public performance, which we touched on earlier with live music, so an artist playing their own song or somebody else's song live at Glastonbury, for example. That is the right of the songwriter to have their music performed publicly. But for a record company, for example, it would be having their recording played on the radio or in the shops. That is a public performance right that exists, but it's not an exclusive right. So there needs to be a way of kind of assessing what the rights are, what was played, who has the rights, and who should be paid. And in this case, public performance and communication to the public, it's generally the collective licensing organizations that do that. Digital audio transmission is mainly US, very similar to performance rights in radio in other countries. And then displaying the public display of copyright works like artwork, lyrics, etc., is another rights type again. So just the summary X's here are again to kind of set up in our minds exactly, maybe a little bit more of the kind of technical terminology, but when you hear the concept of mechanical, that can often mean the mechanical reproduction. So which rights are covered by mechanical reproduction? You would need to get permission to reproduce. You would need to get permission to create a derivative work, and you'd need permission to distribute the copies. So that's kind of how that works. Performance rights, again, public performance, broadcast, digital. That's where the two X's are there. And then synchronization. We know for certain that that is definitely, you know, in fact, there probably should be Chloe an X in the reproduce column there as well, but not to worry. The idea is just to show that there's alignment between these types of rights and exactly what they mean. Print, I just skipped over, but that's fairly self-explanatory. So if we now look at who does the licensing, who collects the money, again, you guys will be familiar with this, so we don't need to spend too much time. But when you're looking at publishing side, the rights types will fall into the concept of copying, in other words, mechanical, or performance, or sync. Somewhere down there is print, but again, that's kind of self-explanatory. And I think what we're getting at here is the idea that there are two rights types that are licensed collectively for the song, in other words, the publishing rights. Sometimes it's the same organization that licenses mechanical and performance, but sometimes it's separate. So in the US, you have a separate organization for different types of, very similar types of, got different rights, but for the same rights holders. But then in other territories, like, for example, the US or Netherlands, you've got PRS for music that used to be just PRS on one side, and then MCPS was separate, but they're now the same organization doing the two different jobs under one roof. Performance rights is similar as well. On the sync side, those rights are exclusive, and they are usually licensed according to private commercial deals by the rights holder themselves, rather than through a collective. And that's why there is an X against sync and print under the example of Warner Chappell, because they will have these rights themselves, and it will be their job to go out and exploit them and get the best deals that they can. Recordings are, again, fairly similar, so it's nice to have a similar structure to refer to. Again, it's slightly different in terms of the way that the actual rights operate, but it's not too far off. You've got the concept of copying, you've got the concept of performance, and you've got the concept of sync, to some extent print as well. But when you look at the skipping on here, the neighboring rights element is slightly different, because that's the entity that's mainly licensed collectively, whereas the other rights generally tend to be licensed by the record companies directly. We've put a note here on sync. You've got to make sure that even though you might be dealing just with a record company for a sync license, don't forget to make sure that you've covered the publishing as well. The two Shakespearean families existing side by side both need to be cleared before you've got the entire rights picture covered to use a recording in the context of a sync. And I think just to wrap up on this section very quickly, again, super quick blast through of rights and who does what, but I hope it's helpful just before Chloe gets into the data. An example here of how a recording is licensed is that you've got the reproduction, the exclusive rights of copying, in other words, sales, distribution, and so forth, controlled by the record company. So they're doing a lot of that business themselves. The distributor, in this case, CD Baby, is doing the technical aggregation of rights and assets, sticking them through into the various endpoint music services. And then you've got the performance rights, the neighboring rights in sound recordings being managed by collectives. Again, you guys will all be familiar with the idea of syncs also being directly licensed, similar to the publishing side. On recordings, it's always the label that owns those exclusive rights, so they're responsible for doing the sync deals, just like the publishing companies. With that very, very quick overview, I wonder if there are any questions. Again, questions either now or at the end of the session, but otherwise, being mindful that we're already about 20 minutes or so into the session, we can hand over to Chloe. But if there are any questions, do raise a hand or jump in, and we're here to help. So fire away.
Cool, Charlie, if you relinquish your screen,
I will relinquish. There we go. There you are.
Amazing. Okay. So yeah, as Charlie was going through the copyright, the underlying shares and the existing IP that we're trying to track that's getting monetized, we're now shifting into well, how do we actually put these rights into some kind of file format in order to share that information across the supply chain. So there's different file types. There's kind of broadly DDEX messages that are explaining things like products and recordings from the distributor out to the DSPs. And then we have messages like CWR file formats, which are explaining the publishing sort of side of that, which is who has the rights in what territory, who are the songwriters on the work, who are the publishers that represent that songwriter, et cetera. And there's obviously, of course, lots of different DDEX standard types. A couple other ones that you may be familiar with are things like DSRs, which are the digital sales reports, or CDR, where you have claims. And really kind of what we're trying to grapple with as an industry, if you've been to the DDEX conferences or you kind of had endless panels about this in your life, is how do we start trying to marry those two sides, and how, because especially when you're dealing with things like flat file formats, it can be very difficult to properly explain hierarchies of things. It can be very cumbersome. There can be very, very large files that are created when you have lots and lots and lots of information, lots of strings of micro pennies and things to be reporting. So I don't think there's a perfect solution today, but I think as a working group for AFEM, what Charlie and I are most interested in trying to work on is explaining the complexities of what happens in electronic music to our industry partners, so that we're actually helping you, help us, help everybody. Because when you start looking at things like remixes, medleys, DJ sets, things like, there are no really one size fits all perfect way to deliver that information, to even describe that information. And so I think this is actually really an important space for us to be trying to kind of raise the banner and help people understand all the different types of rights types that go into something like a one-off remix, live happened in the moment set that happens at a club in Ibiza one day, and how do you actually make sure that you're paying people for that? So of course we have the 5 or 6 different types of people, different verticals in our supply chain. We have the label, who's working with distributors to send things to DSPs, who's then working with the CMOs and the publishers to try to marry up recordings to works. There are claims happening on both sides. The publisher and the label are effectively licensing works back and forth to each other. So you have cleared licenses, mechanical licenses for the label to release things. And information can happen or can be conveyed in lots of different ways, either in a file format like a DDEX message, or in an email, or in a paper napkin, as I like to joke. So I think one of the, there isn't a perfect solution, but I think one of the main concerns for me and Charlie is to make sure that we are illuminating some of the standards or some of the issues that people are seeing on both sides, that we can start to come to the center and say, how can we work on this together? So that's the Romeo and Juliet metaphor that I'm beating to death here. So in a CWR file, if you've ever seen it, it kind of, for the uninitiated, can look just like a bunch of random numbers and letters, and it doesn't really seem as maybe well organized or hierarchied as something like an XML file. But when you do know how to parse it, you do know what is in there, it actually is a pretty straightforward standard, which I actually don't hate, where you have a very clear structure of information that is describing things like publishing chains. So my friend Michael Lau and I created this spreadsheet to try to start explaining what a publishing chain is really doing. And I'm going to use the US-centric model of the 50-50 deals, but it does get a lot more complex when you're looking at European deals where there's different weights based on whether you're a lyricist or a composer. There's different splits between yourself and your publisher, et cetera. So there's actually a lot of really great resources on another AFEM member's website, which is Boomistemra. And also PRS, I know, just did a guide about the best practices around this. So we'll make sure we link a lot of these resources, both in the video if you're watching this, and also on the AFEM Metadata Working Group. We have a page on the website, so you'll have a resource list there as well. So do get into it, especially if you are on the recorded side and you've never really kind of peeked behind the curtain. I think this is really good to know and good to be aware of why certain shares or certain territories are really important to be tracking. So with that said, we'll take this example where Chloe has written a song, and in North America, she has a publisher, an original publisher called Astara Music. She's the composer author, there's the original publisher. And then she also is represented in the United Kingdom by a sub-publisher called Vintage Tea Songs. And so this same chain is going through where we have the original publisher, but now we also have a sub-publisher involved just in the United Kingdom. And then finally, world excluding North America and United Kingdom, there is a different sub-publisher for that territory. And so Nothing But the Beat Music is the sub-publisher there, which could be the administrator, could be a sub-publisher, et cetera. So we also have, as we were talking before about the different rights types, we have things like performance, mechanical, sync, or other types. And there is a distinction between the ownership of that right and the collection right for that type of right. So in the instance where Chloe and her publisher, speaking about myself in third person is weird, have a 50-50 split on performance, but I've actually given my publisher the ownership or the ability to monetize 100% for the other rights types. And then, as you can imagine, they then have the collection right as well. When you have a sub-publishing relationship, you are not relinquishing the ownership of that copyright, but you are relinquishing the collection rights. So you're giving that sub-publisher, that administrator, the right to collect for you in that territory. That's kind of the purpose of why you've hired them. And so you can have these very extensive, very long chains that you see in CWR when there are lots and lots and lots and lots of different sub-publisher relationships in lots of different territories. This happens a lot when you have major contract deals, because that major label, let's say it's Warner, might have a different sub-publisher, Warner France, Warner Spain, Warner Germany. And so you have a ton of these different sub-publishers that are existing in these CWR. They get very weighty. They're very large files. And so, you know, I don't expect anyone on the recorded side to necessarily dig into all of this and love this, but it is important, I think, that we are aware of it. And again, it gets more even granular than this when you are looking at things like the differentiation between a digital performance and a live performance. Those might be different rights types that you're actually giving to different collection societies. So same kind of thing starts happening when you have more than one writer. I mean, those were just 3 large chains for one writer on one song where I wrote 100% of it. But when you start actually splitting out the rights between different writers, then you start getting lots and lots of slight small percentages that might be ending up out that need to be kind of aggregated. And of course, the nightmare is if this doesn't equal 100%, it either equals more or less than 100%. It's a little bit more of an issue if it's more than 100%. Then you're starting to create kind of backlogs of, hey, this computer says no, black box, I don't know how to pay out on this. I don't have all the information. I'm missing a writer. I can't register it without the writer, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't really go into it too much in this presentation, but there are also, you know, things like if you have one writer who is not registered with the CMO, doesn't have an IPI number, you're not able to register that song. You can maybe register your piece of that song, but it's going to start backing up how much the CMO can do for you, how much a publisher can do for you if you have missing information. So you know, we covered a lot in our first webinar, which was aimed at the DJs and creators, about how to make sure that you're doing everything you need to do as the creator to make sure that these folks have the information they need to work on your behalf. But I think there's also equally just as much work that needs to be done by ourselves as companies that are representing these artists and creators to make sure we are giving access to tools, that we're giving access to information. So things like the PRS guide is really wonderful. But that we're also kind of asking ourselves, like, what other information should we be storing and trying to send between ourselves, going back to that diagram of how do I communicate this information? Because if we find out that, hey, only 3 of the 4 writers have an IPI number and one of them doesn't seem to be with a CMO at all, and we can highlight that back to the artist and they can go tell their friend, hi, I need you to register, you know, that's a huge service that would really unlock a lot of money, I think, for the electronic community, especially where you're kind of producing and writing with people in lots of different places, you're working in your bedroom. Not everyone is going to have the same level of knowledge as you. So making sure that, you know, I think whether you're a CD Baby type platform or you're a CMO, that you're helping these creators kind of understand what's going on. And then kind of going over to the DDEX side of things. So this is a bit more obviously hierarchical in an XML format. And you have things like message headers and really clear kind of tagged, this is what this field is, and this is the field value. So things like artist role, main artist. I've blacked out who these people are, hopefully everywhere. So I'm not making fun of anyone or kind of saying, hey, this is wrong. It's not wrong, but what does happen in DDEX is that you lose those publisher chains. So even if you do add information like an indirect resource contributor as a music publisher, and you give the name of the publisher, and then you have another message header that says, here's a lyricist, here's a publisher, here's a composer, etc. It's all flat. There's no connection between the publisher and the writer. Now, if you are using DDEX slightly differently, maybe you can get that connection to be happening, but at least in the examples that I've seen from people, those connections get lost. So when the ERN message goes out to DSPs and they ingest it, they're able to pull all of the composers and push them up as writer credits. If they have a writer credit feature on their platform, for example, they're able to store the publishing information, but it's not connected anymore. So you've lost that chain and you've lost knowing whether or not this particular publisher is the publisher. Is it an original publisher? Is it for North America? Are they a sub-publisher? Are they a sub-publisher just in Germany? Like, you lose all of that granularity in a DDEX file or a DDEX ERN file. And so it becomes kind of a piecing together game on the other side when you're a DSP to try to pull in things like claims that you're getting from a publisher or a CMO about that ownership of that particular recording. And how do you marry that up against what's come to you from the label or the distributor on that side? And oftentimes they won't be the same. They will have discrepancies between the two of them. And I think it particularly does happen a lot in electronic music, where you have maybe remixes that are going on and it's actually a derivative work that does not include a new composer. It's really kind of just a cover song almost, where people are listing themselves as a writer, even if they were just the producer that did the remix. Sometimes you have legitimate derivative works that are created as new works, new compositions, new splits have been drawn up. You also have things where you've cleared things as samples, and you just make sure that you're crediting those writers that you've cleared as well, if that's what you've done in your sample clearance. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the electronic world. Between the writer credits that end up on something like Spotify and what ends up in the writer credits as they are registered with a CMO, for example. So
can I
go ahead, Charlie.
quickly just add a sort of side observation there, because a lot of the concept of correctness and completion of data is directly related to who is the party that has access to the right information, but also at the right time. So if, for example, a record company is using a DDEX ERN file to get a recording up on Spotify, there's every every possibility that the publishing picture isn't actually complete at that point, because maybe an ISWC code hasn't been generated. But should that stop the recording from being made available, even though the data describing that recording is gappy, incomplete, or possibly inaccurate? And the reason for saying this is just to clarify that a lot of the problems that are faced around the industry are not actually because there's a fault. It's just around who's actually got the insight that they need to be able to provide the data accurately, and how and when do they get that so that it's actually capable of plugging it all together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And I think that's a really important point, because you're talking about kind of, you know, remixes and kind of more commercial stuff. It's one of the small things that's better for individual producers who are actually producers, writers, and artists, that the less parties you have, the easier it is to control and have access to all the data that you need to be able to present the complete picture. But it's very quick and easy for that to start fragmenting as soon as you start working with other partners, whether they're on the creative side or the business side.
Yeah, totally. Very good point. So kind of bringing that together, because Charlie, to your point, I think that what I'm trying to get across is that you have a lot of information on the composition side, you have a lot of information on the recorded side. There's no standard format that really combines the two of them in a way that's fit for purpose, we'll say. And these two won't necessarily come back together until the point of trying to reconcile payments, maybe 6, 12, 18 months after the monetization event has happened. And again, I think in the electronic music industry, where you have sort of like virality and spikes around songs that are popular, songs that are getting played a lot, and then it kind of either becomes part of the songbook and everyone plays it forever and ever, or it's kind of like, oh, we've moved on to the next thing. So you really want to make sure that you're not losing out on that event, and then you're making sure that you have all of the collection stuff in place. I didn't want to put anyone's personal information on blast. I'm very worried about GDPR, so I blurted it out. But in this example, which is Martin Garrix's album, you're looking at metadata that describes this product, like a UPC or EAN code, ISRCs that are describing the recordings. And then, as Charlie said, when an ISWC is assigned, if an ISWC is assigned, you also have that identifier for a work. But there's going to be other ways to describe works, proprietary work codes. I guess all you can really do, things like a title and writer combination. But the more you can try to complete the picture as possible, no matter where you are in the vertical, I think the better shot you have at making sure that you've deduplicated claims, that you've ironed out where there's things that are being overclaimed, where you're ironing out things where there's discrepancies, and you're making sure that you have a clean or a quick way to make those payments. IPI numbers, of course, being very helpful if you have them. And I think there are discussions happening in the industry which are exciting about how can we start including IPI numbers, you know, in commercially released information. If you have the songwriter name, can you get the IPI too? Because how do I know this John Smith is not that John Smith? And that would be a very helpful thing. But also, to Charlie's point, and everyone we've had this discussion with, there's also that who has the authoritative information and who has access to it. And I'm not coming with solutions, I'm coming with questions really to this webinar, because if you start asking distributors to send IPI numbers, or if you ask a label to ask a publisher to ask for an IPI number, then at what point does that information become less reliable because it's come through, you know, the telephone? And also, you know, if it is not reliable, and if it isn't the person's kind of personal, like, I don't have a relationship with this writer, I have a relationship with the artist, and it's not the writer in this case, how much should you be, quote, responsible for having to put that information as well? And certainly we don't want to say that in the absence of an ISWC or an IPI that you can't release something, because that might take months to be assigned, or never be assigned. So yeah, there's kind of like this catch-22. And I think one of the things that I, again, would find most interesting to come out of this webinar is, as part of the working group that we're doing with AFEM, is having a discussion with the different working groups, with the CMO working group, with the DSP working group, and chatting about how we can resolve some of these kind of existential problems between combining the recording and the composition together earlier on in the process. So we have a better shot at trying to monetize these things at the point of that sort of virality or that release date. So bringing it together, where we have casting our mind back to Charlie's copyright tables and the people that are responsible for them. So we obviously have on the recorded side, distributors, labels, neighboring rights organizations trying to go off and collect the money and distribute the money back to the right parties based on just the recording and products. And we also have on the composition side, the publishers, CMOs, PROs, et cetera, collecting on the work and bringing that back together. So you have, if you are a DJ producer and you are therefore an artist, maybe also releasing your own music and producing your own music, you are both of these things. You have people representing both of you here. It's all like the money is all going to the same bank account potentially, but it's coming from a lot of different places, and there can be discrepancies even between like how many streams your distributor thinks you have between this master and its two extended mixes, let's say, and what your CMO might know about it, because maybe they only know about one of the extended mixes. And so all of a sudden you have a discrepancy in your own kind of internal checks coming in between those two things. And I think because there's very little crossover as an industry where we're actually looking at these things together and saying, hey, do you have the same number of streams as me? Do you have the same kind of rights picture? Do you have the same ISRC to work links as me? It makes it difficult because everyone's kind of chasing down the same information and they're not kind of working on it together. So up on my soapbox, I would say I would also love to have kind of solutions or things that people think might help try to bridge this gap. Because again, I think especially in a fast moving kind of release space where you have electronic music's very fast, you can be writing something and then release it tomorrow if you wanted to, because you're in control of your own music on your laptop. And where you're also doing lots of remixes, both official and unofficial. What happens with bootlegs that are going up on SoundCloud? What happens with remixes that you created just for the purpose of a particular show that you then released? Like, I think there's just so many different places that, the industry is going to be expanding into, that we need to really make sure that this fairly straightforward, but also has been in place since like 1800 type of information is all in order. Which brings us to opportunities. I won't spend too much on this actually, because the third and final webinar in our series is actually mostly focused on this, but I'll just quickly kind of explain why some of these areas rely on this metadata. So you're looking at things like clearing licenses, in particular micro licensing on platforms like a YouTube or a TikTok. NFTs, they're kind of less exciting these days, but people who want to try to sell their music in alternative ways or tokenize ownership, you need to know the ownership. Longer tail revenue, things like UGC and anything that's kind of an unofficial version of your music that might exist would be great to collect that longer term. And then, of course, as we expand into places like the metaverse and just kind of almost a free-for-all of intellectual property use, what do we do? We're also looking at things specific to us in our industry about tracking live performances and specifically the performances of masters and remixes that happen in DJ sets that are kind of not as plug and play as just I started a track, I ended a track. Clearing samples, of course, is very important because sampling is happening in almost every song that you hear. Monetizing stems or project files, DJs that want to send and sell particular stems or like sounds or VSTs. And then also creating their own online performances, which kind of does create a whole set of other questions and problems where it's like, it's both a radio performance, is it a podcast? Is it actually a recording that I'm selling? How do I clear this? How do I get money from it? So all of that kind of stuff. And lots of different companies, some of which are AFEM members, are working on this problem and kind of, make a suggestion to us to try to look at this together as an industry. And with that, I will close the official portion of this webinar. So for those watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us. There will be links again to everything we mentioned in the link section. And we'll also be posting it up on the AFEM website. And we will have a third and final webinar about expanding into these opportunities and how do we future-proof our metadata coming in the following weeks. So please keep an eye on AFEM socials. If you're not a member, please consider joining. It's a really fun group. You can talk to Finley Johnson. Thank you, Finley. And you can find everything you need on the website. Thank you.
That sounded like one of the benefits of joining AFEM.